And I'm really thrilled to have all of you here today. As Lisa said, I am the president and CEO of CF Leads. And for those of you who don't know, we are a network of community foundations that are working together as peers to build strong communities. So we help build capacity of community foundations to be great grant makers and more. We kind of share what we're all learning with each other and then really try to galvanize community foundations on particular issues. Like Lisa, I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this important conversation on migration and how we can support transnational communities across borders. As Lisa mentioned, she is our project director for CCA, Connecting Communities in the Americas. And I don't know if you mentioned the mission of CCA, Lisa, did you? So I'm happy to do that. So CCA was formed about 7 or 8 years ago with a meeting at the offices of the Inter-American Foundation with support from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And it really is now an international effort, which is managed by CF Leads, to inspire and strengthen community foundations and their partners for local impact as they address issues that transcend borders. So that really is the mission of CF Leads, of CCA. And one of the things that CCA has done is support community foundations and their communities through mapping grants to help them really understand those communities. And so right now we have 7 community foundation grantees doing mapping research. And those are of their low immigrant communities, including sort of migrants in transit. And so there are 4 grantees in the United States, 1 in Mexico and 2 in Brazil. And then in addition, we have 5 community foundations that are implementing action projects that have resulted in what they have learned from their mapping. And you'll hear from some of these folks from Delaware, Florida, Morelos, and Malinalco, and Jalisco. So really looking forward to hearing from them too. And Lisa, did you mention about your peer resource sharing? I'm happy to do that if you hadn't mentioned that either. Okay, great. So Lisa has also been providing regular virtual and in-person opportunities to build relationships across organizations and across countries, frankly. And so we invite you to participate in the monthly peer resource sharing sessions on various topics, and a number of you already have been participating in those. But in June and July, we're going to be discussing ideas and resources on participatory grant making, which of course is shifting the decision making on grant making, at least, towards the communities that we serve. And really pleased to have Lisa she's been on board a few years now, to just really taking CCA to a whole new level, really connecting up diverse groups, diverse organizations. So really grateful that she's been able to connect with Andrew Selee and the panel that will follow. So sorry about my internet glitch, but welcome everybody. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And so since this is not a webinar, it's set up as a meeting, you may find it helpful to change your view. On my screen, it's the top right-hand corner, to speaker view, and that might help you to focus on who's actually speaking today, whatever works best for you. So Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be here, and what a fabulous group, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it was really a pleasure to meet you. We had a call about a month ago when we took the chance to invite you, knowing I'm sure you have a terribly busy schedule, but really we've learned how close to your heart Mexico is. Speaking, you're bilingual, you're bicultural really in a way. And so invested in research across the Americas. and really bringing data to the forefront of how we are talking about migration, which is obviously such a help to community foundations as we do our programming. So I have a couple of questions for you today, Andrew. The first one is, what are some of the important migration trends that you and your team have been seeing across the Americas today? And very importantly, what are the assets that these individuals and families are bringing to their new homes?
You know, I mean, this is a time where we've seen a lot of movement in the Americas. I mean, people, you know, and you don't have to go very far if you're in the United States to see the stories, you know, on the nightly news or in your newspaper or, you know, online and social media about the border. But there's a lot of movement elsewhere also, right? I mean, a lot of people are trying to come to the United States, particularly right now. There was a huge surge in 2019, there's a huge surge since last year. But there's also a lot of people that have moved elsewhere. And so there's, you know, 6 million Venezuelans that have left their country as the things became unsustainable economically. And there was a lot of political conflict and persecution. And, you know, most of them went to the rest of Latin America. Over 5 million went to other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And, you know, Haitians moved after the 2010 earthquake. There was a huge move. There's 300 to 4, at least there was 300 to 400,000 Haitians in between Brazil and Chile, which is a fairly large number, a handful in Ecuador, a handful in Mexico. I had a great meal at a Haitian restaurant in Tijuana, Mexico, about 3 weeks ago. One of several, you know, I mean, this is unusual, by the way. Latin America, you know, there's always been movement in Latin America, but it was never, and certainly in the Caribbean, but not on this magnitude. Nicaraguans, if anyone's in Costa Rica, I mean, you know, there, you know, are about 9% of the population of Costa Rica is made up of people born in Nicaragua. And the latest wave was since the repression of protests in 2018. And it's been somewhere around 150,000 people that moved to Costa Rica. Say 150,000, that's not big. It's not big if you're Brazil, but it's really big if you're Costa Rica. Actually, it's 2% of your population. So it is actually, hugely noticeable. And so there is this huge movement of people, and there's lots of people on the move, right? I mean, lots of people are moving through Panama and Costa Rica and other countries. And I would say there's been, countries in Latin America have been very pragmatic, and the Caribbean as well, in how they've responded to migration. They've mostly tried to give people legal documents. It's especially true in Colombia, that is working on giving documents to what will eventually be about 2 million Venezuelans. The official number is 1.8, but there's really about 2 million. I can tell you this because we just talked to the person who knows this a couple of weeks ago and is doing the regularization, and said, we've got, more than 2 million applications right now. So there's a lot going on, and they've tried to give legal guidance. Ecuador is doing the same thing. Peru's been doing the same thing. Mexico has been very active on asylum, as has Costa Rica. And one of the things Mexico does actually is incorporate people who get asylum. Working with UNHCR, they actually try and take people to areas of Mexico. They've got 15 cities now where they resettle people in Mexico, and they actually try and get them a job. They build business networks of employers who are looking for workers. And so they try and give them temporary housing, not great housing, but, temporary housing while they find something. And then there's a whole bevy of employers that are looking for workers for them to be able to settle, get a job, and then get their own place. And they provide some other services along the way. So there's a lot of creativity going on. I don't want to underplay that these are also countries that, struggle with, and some of you are from these countries, but they already have issues of overcrowded classrooms and overcrowded emergency rooms. And, when other people arrive, when you get 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia or 150,000 Nicaraguans in Costa Rica or in southern Mexico, lots of people show up and stay there on their way to the United States. This does, or they get sent back to Tijuana or Ciudad Juarez from the U.S. It does create strains on services that are already taxed. And obviously there's some pushback to that as well. And you don't have the kind of state services that you have. I just got back from Canada at midnight last night. It's wonderful talking to people about immigration in Canada. Canada brings people in, they give them wraparound services. I mean, it is amazing how the Canadians have it. And I kept thinking, if you could only transplant this to Colombia or Costa Rica or Mexico, this would be amazing. But of course, that's not going to happen, right? That's a different level, a different kind of state capacity and resourcing that most of these countries don't have. So countries have been very creative, but this is where all of you come in, right? Because here you have lots of migrants who are starting over. They often have very high human capital. If you look at the Haitian population in South America, or you look at, they always have college education, but they tend to actually skew, fairly educated compared to the Haitian population. Venezuelans are actually very well educated. It's a country that was very well educated before it started to collapse economically. So like half the Venezuelans in Peru, for example, have a college degree. I mean, which is amazing. Most Peruvians don't realize that because these folks are working in restaurants and driving Ubers, but they often were a doctor in their home country, right? Or they ran their own business. So there's lots of things. There's lots of true. No, it's good rain. No, it's raining. That's right. My 5-year-old daughter has joined our conversation here to tell me it just started raining, so we can't go scootering afterwards. So excuse me. There is a huge asset in the people coming. There's a lot of desire to start anew, but yes, there are some real challenges, right? I mean, there's also a significant, in some ways, what Latin American and Caribbean countries have done is yes, try and give people legal documents. They don't always succeed, by the way. I should say, all the regularization programs don't always reach everyone. So I mean that, it's been a bet on giving people legal status that hasn't always succeeded, but generally has been different than what you've seen in the US, where we're much more skeptical about it, right? And we've allowed a large undocumented population to stay for a long time. At the same time, there are, strains on services, and people largely have to fend for themselves, right? People are moving into the informal economy usually, trying to get their kids in schools. Most countries other than Trinidad and Tobago have let people go to school, maybe get emergency services, but not always full medical services. And so the real needs, in order for people to live their real potential and to start a life anew, there are also some real challenges, but there's also a context where there's some willingness to do this.
Right. So what would you recommend for community foundations, Andrew, in our work as place-based institutions that are often well-connected with other sectors, certainly of the nonprofit sector, sometimes also with city governments or county governments, universities. Where do you see opportunities for us and our partners to step in and really know, aside from political points of view, but as institutions that are interested and really devoted to improving the lives of the people that live in our cities and doing it together with our communities?
I think there's all sorts of opportunities. I mean, I'm going to give you a laundry list, and we can talk about any of them that are more relevant than others if you want. But I would say it starts from understanding who people are. I think that's a big question, is simply understanding. So I wouldn't be a good researcher if I didn't tell you that you should invest in research. I don't think you should only invest in research, but it's good to understand who's moved where, what their challenges are. That's often necessary to know what next investment to make. Secondly, I think there's huge issues on legal status still. I mean, actually getting people, the last mile. A lot of countries are willing to do this, but they don't always reach the populations who would benefit from legalization. There's often distrust from getting to announcing and giving your address and your name to a government official. So, how do you build that infrastructure that allows people to actually get legal status? There is issues on education. It's not talked about very much. I mean, there's a huge Brazil, for example, which has been very generous with Venezuelans and has in fact been sort of doing a relocation program, giving people legal status and relocating them elsewhere in Brazil. There you have a language gap, right, for Venezuelans, for example. You don't have that with Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. You do sometimes with Haitians in Mexico, but not always, because they've usually been somewhere else in Latin America. So it's often less visible than in, say, Canada or the United States, where someone comes in and they're coming from a different system, but there's huge educational issues just in figuring out what classroom people should be in, what level of education they are. How do you provide support services to kids who've missed school for a year, right, as they were migrating, or their parents couldn't register them at first, and so they actually missed a year of school along the way, or a school that's never seen people that are different, right, that speak different, that how do you think about that? So education is one area. Healthcare is probably not as as usual. But there is, both emergency health care when there's large movements of people, but also thinking long term how you get people affiliated to healthcare systems matters. I think there's a lot on entrepreneurship that matters. I mean, a lot of people were entrepreneurs in their home country. They had small businesses. How do you help them do that? Other people were professionals who are probably not going to be able to practice. We talk a lot about the need for countries to revalidate, to recognize, professional degrees. But in reality, it's hard to do this, right? We don't even, in the US, we struggle to do this. I lived through this with my mother, who was a nurse educated in another country, who spent years trying to get, become an RN in the United States, actually, right after having been out for a bit. And, it is hard to do, it's a good thing to do. But what that means is some people who are professionals, they may have been doctors or dentists or lawyers or engineers in their home country. Their pathway back into the middle class eventually, and it's going to take some time, is to be an entrepreneur. This is part of why you see in the US, immigrants have twice the rate of entrepreneurship as the native born. Some of this is sort of self-selection, and immigrants are often very, it takes someone with some drive already to pick up and go, right? I mean, no matter how they come, right? I mean, it takes, so there's a bit of self-selection, but it's also that people find other avenues blocked, right? I mean, people who had aspirations to be in the middle class might have had the training for it. And so entrepreneurship is actually a really interesting area. And then I would say there's a whole area around, there's an area on financial inclusion, how to get banks to also give people bank accounts as well as credit. Anyone who's moved across borders knows your credit history disappears often when you move, depending how you move. Even if you're sort of moving legally and with, for professional reasons, sometimes you lose it. And then there's a whole basket, I'll end with this, which is social cohesion. In societies that are going through rapid transformation, and certainly the US is living through this right now, but many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are living through this, maybe they haven't, recently, these were not always immigrant countries, right? I mean, most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean saw themselves as immigrant countries. These are people, lots of people were leaving to go live in the United States and Canada and Europe, maybe occasionally Australia, but they weren't, we weren't getting a lot of immigrants. All of a sudden, there are a lot of immigrants, right? A lot of refugees. What is the narrative that says that we all belong here? I mean, what is it? If you're Mexico, I know, Lisa and I share a love of Mexico, and I'm enjoying Eric's beautiful view of Cuernavaca there, there's, if you're Mexico, and, the idea of being Mexican has always been that we're a unique people, and I should say my wife is Mexican. All of my kids are binational, bicultural, bilingual. So I feel better speaking about Mexico than I do about other countries. I belong there. Mexico is sort of based on, first of all, we're not Americans, right? And secondly, we are, we fought against America. We're not America, but we're also unique and distinct from everyone else. How do you actually begin to bend that to understand, to be an inclusive country where you could be a Haitian Mexican, or you can be a Venezuelan Mexican or a Salvadoran Mexican, when that wasn't really very common? I mean, and this has already been bent because there have been huge debates around being indigenous in Mexican, being Afro-Mexican, right? So these are conversations that have been going on in other ways already. But this has added a whole new dimension in there. And this is true of all of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that are dealing with migration. Is now all of a sudden you have immigrants who weren't there before. In most countries, there are a few exceptions, but most countries did not have this experience before. And so it's stretching the sense of who we are. And it's stretching just at a practical level, at a very community level, which is where many of you are really poised to operate. Right. How do you get people who are immigrants together with people who are not immigrants, who are the native born there, in settings where they're, interacting as equals, where they're maybe problem solving together, where they're trying to do, where they're seen as, on the same side, rather than as this foreign object that just dropped down here and made our schools more crowded, right? And that's a huge, that could be a hugely important investment in terms both of creating social cohesion, but also doing some problem solving around the other real issues that are sometimes there as populations expand.
Yeah,
so that's a laundry list, Lisa.
Thank you so much. That was a lot. So many different areas that we can think about, and and then thinking about our own missions and visions for our communities, and which of these can we really strengthen? You know, so many community foundations are working in impact investing or capacity building for entrepreneurs. In Canada, I've read that if not the majority, a huge amount of the entrepreneurs are actually immigrants, first generation immigrants. You know, that's very common. And so you've given us some fantastic ideas of just how to think about this with social cohesion. You said, how are we messaging we all belong here? And these are so very important. I wish we had all day to talk about this. I know you have so much information, but I would like to open it up for some questions from our audience. So I'm going to switch mine back to gallery so that I can see people. Does anyone have questions that you could put in the chat, or you can raise your hand? But Andrew, questions for Andrew specifically on their research at the Migration Policy Institute, or how, you know, the learning that they've done might help you in your own work. And I do want to recognize a comment in the chat from Andrea Dix, who's the president of the Canadian Community Foundations, and realizing that although Canada, you know, does have this welcoming system set up for a certain amount of people immigrating to the country, really still recognizing that there are inequities that we continue to deal with. There is continued racism that appears as within every other country. And so our role, obviously, as community foundations and partners working together, our work never ends in that, I think. So recognizing.
And totally in agreement, by the way, on that too. So, I mean, that's certainly the case. Just the resources and the, you know, and the institutional capacity is certainly different.
Right.
Yes, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect system.
Exactly. So we have a question from Alma Cota, who's going to be on our panel later. She's from Nogales. And she said, how can we get access to this data that you're talking about? And maybe you can mention online how that works.
I can, so there's not great data. I mean, one of the problems is there is not a sort of central place you can go. We have a website where we put lots of stuff up called the Migration Portal. It's literally migrationportal.org. So you will see a lot of information, but I will confess it is not fully organized. I mean, you know, our next sort of way, we've like added everything, every resource we can find on migration in Latin America. We're a little behind, but we've been adding stuff. But our next process is to try and actually add stuff on there in an organized way so you can find it, including some data, some basic data sheets. But happy if you know, send me something to A. Selee, S-E-L. I'll put my email in there in a bit, but I'm happy to send you, you know, whatever information we might have. We have been gathering a lot, and I should say this is a team of us. I mean, it's a group that's all from the region, except for one Canadian colleague who's actually Haitian Canadian, and the rest of the team are actually all from Latin America. So we've been working on this for a while, and so we've gathered a lot of information. But you know, I would say we have it in lots of different articles right now, mostly, and eventually we will get a data set up there for quick consultation.
Yeah. And what I've done is literally signed up to be on the Migration Policy Institute mailing list, and you get their most current publications coming out. And I often refer to the Migration Policy Institute page. You can go to regions, and then by region, you know, within Latin America and the Caribbean, and then, you know, it goes down with the different publications that they've had.
I should say, by the way, since you're in Nogales, I don't know if you're in Nogales, Arizona, or Nogales, Sonora.
She's in Sonora, yeah.
In Sonora, okay. I actually launched my last book in Nogales, Arizona. So that was actually the book launch. So you know, we wanted to do it at the border because it was about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So it was at the community college. So,
wonderful.
Yeah.
Nick, what would you like to ask?
Thank you, and thank you, Andrew. So try to formulate the question, but please tease out what you tease out of it. One of the important premises at the start of this program, Connecting Communities in the Americas, years ago, was this idea of a person being transnational. I.e., they live in one place now, but they have these deep, strong ties to another place. Usually, if it's migrants, where they came from. Obviously, there are other sources of those kinds of deep connections, but immigrants are the prevalent ones. So, and part of the premise of the program was to support the connections, not just the integration of somebody coming in, but what's the value of retaining the connection to where they came from, and what are some of the ways that could end up being of benefit to both places, be that as it may. And we try to get a little bit more local, not just say Mexico and the US, but, Oaxaca and Chicago, or, so that we get something that's, a little more directed to where people came from rather than just an entire country. This obviously brings up dilemmas of identity, right? There's probably an assumption, let's say if I'm an American, so we kind of the natural default would be, okay, you came here from somewhere, so now you're supposed to become an American. And we've started with this idea of like hyphenating, Mexican American, I happen to be Ukrainian American, what have you, but that could lead to also a little bit of skepticism of, well, how American are you really, right? So, and I imagine that might then, when you describe the idea of, say, a Haitian Mexican, for example, or a Venezuelan Colombian, or what have you, that could lead to those identities, those dilemmas of how does that idea of essentially a split identity can be used as an asset, and as a way to advance whatever it might be in the communities, both from where people left as well as to the one where people have come to. And I wonder if you've done any research on what happens after the migration, and how important, or what was the value add of retaining the connection to where people came from.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And by the way, I've always, my sense has always been that people get to choose whether they are fully, they want to fully adopt where they've arrived. And, I have a friend who fits in that category. He's American, doesn't, was born elsewhere, but he's American, doesn't really matter. My mother was from Denmark. She never became a U.S. citizen, against my sisters and my advice, by the way. But she always felt that she was Danish, decades later, and then everywhere in between. Like lots of people say I'm fully, if you ask my wife, she would say she's fully American and she's fully Mexican, right? I mean, and she's at home in both countries, and she's lived half of her life in each, probably more in the U.S. at this point. But, and in some things she's more American, in some things she's more Mexican, right? And I think we all fall on the continuum, right? And if we live abroad, and I'm sure on this call there's many people who either live or have lived, outside of their country of birth. I mean, we all sort of, make different choices. But I think transnationalism can be really powerful. I don't think we should expect everyone to be transnational, but I think it can, for those that want to keep ties to where they came from, and that's most migrants. I mean, it is most migrants. And it carries on sometimes to the second and third generation, with different, degrees, right? I mean, you see a lot of people feel very Ukrainian right now. We're Ukrainian American, right? I mean, even if they were not born in Ukraine, right? I mean, this is really there are different moments this gets actualized, right, too, in our lives. You see right now, I mean, the first thing is remittances. If you look at some countries, remittances are small in Mexico. I mean, in numbers, they're large, right? Mexico and India and China are sort of the big countries for remittances in terms of numbers, but it's only like 3 or 4% of the economy. That's big. I mean, 3 or 4% is not nothing, but, and it is 10 or 15% in some states of Mexico. If you go to Michoacan or Zacatecas, the percentage is probably in the 10 to 15% range. So, I mean, that's really significant. But if you go to Guatemala, it's 18%. In El Salvador and Honduras, I can't remember which is which, it's 22 and 23%. That's basically a quarter of the economy is remittances. I mean, that is an enormous amount of the money that people are sending back to their families is just an enormous, part of the economy. And it's an enormous part of people's livelihoods, right? I mean, it is a big part of how people are getting ahead. And so there is a lot of opportunities on remittances. I mean, one is, how do you help people take advantage of the money they're getting to invest some of it? A lot of it's invested in housing, which is an investment, and some of it's, and sometimes I actually say, people say it's all consumption. Well, eating better is actually not just consumption. It's an investment in your children growing up to be healthier, right? I mean, and, more education is certainly an investment. And, some of the things, you buy a TV, maybe, buy a bigger TV, that's probably consumption. But, some other things probably investment. But how do you help people that are getting remittances, for example, turn that into entrepreneurship? Not everyone's going to do that, but people that want to. Or how do you help people turn that into being able to shift what crops they're growing, because maybe they're able to get into, something else that they can market at a higher value. So there's some opportunities there. There are a lot of collective remittances. People raise money to send back to their hometowns. So also helping people figure out what are the investments that they can make to improve the collective livelihood of places they've left behind. And the other thing about migrants, and this is particularly notable in Latin America and the Caribbean, where governments don't always work as well as people wish they would, is that migrants sometimes can hold government leaders accountable in a way that people in the communities can't. And this is good and bad. I mean, it's sort of unusual. This is something we started to find a few years ago with a couple of colleagues, Gaspar Rivera Salgado and Xochitl Bada and Jonathan Fox and I were working on a project together and looking more at Mexico. And one thing we found is that actually, public leaders, because the migrants are sending remittances, and because they sometimes send back collective remittances to fix the road or to, build the church or expand the school, they have a lot of power with politicians. And, sometimes politicians that are used to clientelistic politics and they're used to the public being a little bit docile can't do that with migrants, and that's good and bad. I mean, it's good and bad because in the sense migrants can become overpowerful also, right, at the expense of people that are still there. But sometimes it creates a virtuous cycle, right, where politicians that otherwise might not be that accountable actually feel like they have to be transparent when they're dealing with migrant groups, right? If we're going to invest together to expand the school, and the municipality is going to put in some money, but so is the migrant association. We actually have to have some transparent accounts around this. So that kind of transnationalism is fascinating. And then, I think the implicit also, Nico, you're saying people come and go, right? So people stay. We always assume migration is sort of people go and leave, but they also come back a lot. And so people come back with new skills, new ideas, and I think some of those are, that's hugely transformational for people, but sometimes for families and entire communities. Sometimes the migrants that come back can be detonators of innovation in really creative ways. I remember one really concrete, I'll stop with this, but one really concrete example was in Zacatecas, in a small town in Zacatecas, not that far from the capital, where a guy who had decided to come back on his own, had actually he'd taken over his family's farm. But one of the things he'd done was a pig farm. One of the things he'd done is he realized he had a lot of manure. Great to talk about manure in a conference, always in a meeting. But he had lots of manure. It's like organic tomatoes need manure. When I was in the United States, I realized there was an organic market. It's like Whole Foods and all this stuff out there, that people are buying at a higher rate. If I grow organic tomatoes, I can actually, I could actually bring an income that no one else is getting. So you have a whole community now in this town that's growing organic tomatoes, not just him, right? I mean, he brought other people into this, but because he knew that there was this possibility that no one else knew about. And you see lots of that happening in other ways, right? Where people are bringing back a different know-how. I was just in a community in Guatemala actually a few months ago that was very similar to that, where people were going to Canada and coming back and growing different kinds of crops that they could sell to the Canadian market, for example. So.
Thank you. Very good. We do have a couple other questions, but we need to move on to the panel discussion. If you need a break for a minute or two, go ahead and do that. We'll give it maybe 2 minutes. And in the meantime, get ready for the panel. But thank you so much. Andrew, for joining us today and for really giving this valuable information about what the policy, Migration Policy Institute does, and just some of your learning from that. So
thank you. Great to be with you. And I'm going to put my email up there in case anyone wants to follow up. So
continue. So our next session is a panel discussion. We've invited 4 community foundations representatives to come and talk about some of their experiences in actually working with their transnational communities, whether they be immigrants or family members who have relatives in another country, people in transit as well as border. I think you'll find this very interesting. And so I'd like to give just a brief introduction of our moderator and then each of the 4 panelists, and we'll get started. So our moderator today is Eric Friend. If you could wave, please. Eric is a great friend to Mexico, having lived there for more than 30 years and serving as the president of Comunidad, a community foundation based in Cuernavaca. He is also on the board of the Alliance of Community Foundations, or has been, I'm not sure if you are now, of Mexico, also called Comunalia. Eric, on the side, works with 2 programs called ALEM and Enchúlame la Silla, roughly translated as Jazz to My Chair or Jazz My Chair. In these programs, individuals who use wheelchairs repair the wheelchairs of others. We are honored to have Eric be the moderator today. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. The first member of our panel is Alma Cota de Yáñez, who's been the executive director of Fundación del Empresariado Sonorense, or FESAC, for 19 years at the Mexican border city of Nogales. FESAC is one of the first Mexican community foundations, and it promotes the concept of social investment as opposed to charity for the local and statewide networks of nonprofits. Being on a border town, one of the main focus areas that they work in is supporting shelters for migrants and asylum seekers in transit. Our next panel member is Jalil Guadarrama Jurado. He's an social anthropologist from the municipality of Malinalco in central Mexico, devoted to studying the cultures and societies of his country. Jalil coordinates social and environmental projects at the Community Foundation in Malinalco and promotes grassroots development, community development with a lens of interculturalism, respect, equity, and justice. Then we have Jonathan Romin. John has spent the past 18 years in Southwest Florida. He's a landscape architect, entrepreneur, and currently the entanglements lead at the Collaboratory in Fort Myers. He has an affinity for measuring results, yet has a major soft spot for people and sees each day as an opportunity to help someone succeed or empower a whole community of someones to make a better future. Last but not least, we welcome Stuart Comstock-Gay, who is the president and CEO of the Delaware Community Foundation, where he leads the team's work to improve quality of life in Delaware by empowering and growing philanthropy through knowledge and relationships. Stuart has spent his entire career addressing issues of community, democracy, and civil rights, both in philanthropy and civil rights work. He has served as adjunct faculty in nonprofit leadership, written for numerous national publications, been a regular radio commentator, and spoken before hundreds of audiences on a wide range of foundation, democracy, voting rights, and civil liberty issues. So welcome to all of you. And Eric, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. So wonderful to be here. see so many faces of those that I do know. Most of you I know, I think, and some new people that I don't know, but thank you for this opportunity. As a migrant myself, it's things that I don't always think about on a day-to-day basis, but it's wonderful to reflect upon. The idea of this space with the panel is to take sort of these ideas that are so big on a world level, but how are they living out in each of our communities on both sides of the border? So it's an opportunity for each of our panelists to sort of talk about their experience, about what they're doing with it, how's it affecting their communities, what are the gifts that they're bringing, what are the challenges that are being brought. So in that line of being as specific and concrete as we can, we want to hear from your community foundation. How are you engaging with the people in your region, with those who have lived the experience of migration, with migrants or people returning migrants? And also wonderful, I know our first panelist very well. I've been in Nogales with Alma. I've also been in Malinalco just recently with Halil. And I grew up near Delaware, so that's wonderful. Florida will be wonderful. I love the soft spot for people. That's great. So Alma, tell us a little bit about how you're engaging with the migrants in such an intensely important area for migration.
Thank you. And I'm very happy to see that Nick is here, because we met Nick on day one, so he knows what the path we have walked in those so many years as a community foundation. We are a community foundation that is statewide. That means Hermosillo, the state capital, Obregón, and Nogales. We are the border town. And the biggest issue regarding data, et cetera, as I was asking Andrew, is that there is no data. We have to, keep the TV on, watch the US news, read some papers, et cetera. We just read 2 weeks ago that 50% of the migrants that have been deported from the US crossed through Sonora. 50%. It was a number that completely, opened up our eyes more than we already are. So what we have been doing is supporting donations, both finance, cash and in-kind donations for the shelters. We have had a huge amount of new migrants arriving, seeking asylum from Guerrero, and of course the Northern Triangle now, from Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, hundreds of them, and almost 80% of them with kids. So we have moved, as Lisa said, from the basic charity, which is food, clothes. We are the bridge for that, but we also open another bridge for social investment, which is education. The children and the adults have been waiting here in the past 2 years during the pandemic, at least 9 months prior to their crossing. So in those 9 months, we have developed a very strong educational program, teachers, hiring teachers, et cetera. And that's another part of social investment, creating jobs of local, recently graduated teachers that couldn't find a job because schools were closed. So it's a full circle. And then we have been doing that for 2 years now. And now we started this past January 2022 with adults. All of the adults waiting for asylum were asking for opportunities. So we got in an agreement with CCA, which is a vocational training school in Mexico for anyone over 15. You don't even have to know how to read and write. So the migrants, we had a survey and they decided to go for electricity, plumbing, teacher said, basic nursing, and hair cutting and makeup. We all know that when these migrants cross, and they have been started crossing since last week, even though Title 42 was not lifted, I
forgot to say in the beginning, 2 minutes each, but finish up your thought. And
I'm sorry, I was waiting for the call and I had the what right here, sorry. We know all of these migrants are going to work from home, undocumented. So if you know how to cut hair, you will have a lot of neighbors coming for you to cut their hair. So that's the basic newest current story. Sorry.
No problem. Very good. Thank you, Alma. And sorry for not saying that. I'll give each of you like a little, maybe I'll put a symbol on my screen at 20 seconds to the end. I hope you'd see that instead of having to butt in on you. So Halil, I was just in Malinalco with you a month and a half ago or something like that. Wonderful to see you and bienvenido.
And Halil will be speaking in See, Jalil will be speaking in Spanish. Sorry to interrupt. So go ahead. If you need interpretation in English, you can push the button at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes. Go ahead.
Perfecto. Comienzo de una vez. ¿Sí? La misma, claro. Pues nosotros en Fundación estamos cumpliendo recientemente este año 15 años trabajando para y por la comunidad de Malinalco. Justamente el tema migratorio es algo nuevo para nosotros, pero también es algo muy representativo porque en el municipio de Malinalco las dinámicas del fenómeno de la migración están instauradas y son muy concurridas. La mayoría de las comunidades del municipio tienen la migración como una de sus principales fuentes de empleo, de sustento incluso, ¿no? Entonces, está por todos lados. Nosotros realizamos un diagnóstico y nos dimos cuenta que por cada familia malinalquense, al menos existe un conocido o un familiar directo que es migrante, ¿no? Y que está vinculado con ellas y que está en los Estados Unidos. Actualmente nosotros estamos incursionando en este tema para poder crear modelos de acercamiento, para poder ver la manera en cómo nosotros intervenimos directamente a este tema. Y estamos comenzando por desarrollar estudios acerca de la migración en Malinalco, de por qué es que surge, cómo se da, cuáles son todas esas dinámicas sociales y culturales que implica que la migración exista en nuestros municipios, ¿no? Como manera de acercamiento, en este momento estamos nosotros ejecutando un proyecto que se llama Por un Malinalco sin Fronteras, en el que buscamos que migrantes en Estados Unidos también sean conscientes y vean la parte de la filantropía comunitaria, aportando o donando hacia proyectos comunitarios que se encuentran aquí en el municipio de Malinalco, haciendo algo por la comunidad, porque nos damos cuenta que los migrantes sí están presentes, son parte de las dinámicas sociales de Malinalco, aunque estén en el exterior, porque aportan para las fiestas patronales, porque aportan para infraestructura en sus pueblos o para distintas tradiciones que se les demanda, pero queremos que ellos también vean la importancia de cómo se pueden vincular de esta manera filantrópica en un proyecto comunitario, en un proyecto con un impacto socioambiental aquí en Malinalco, ¿no? Entonces estamos en ese trabajo actualmente.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jalil. As we're practically neighbors, and yet we live experiences of migration a little differently, but it's great to be able to work together and collaborate with you. And now, again, where the same question is about being concrete and specific, what are our community, how are our community foundations engaging with people in our region that have lived experiences with migration? And now I'll turn to John. I'm very curious to hear about how your numbers and results and soft spot for humans plays out with migrants. So needed.
Thanks, Eric. And so happy to be here and share what we're doing at Collaboratory in Southwest Florida, specifically Fort Myers. And over the past 8 years, we've had 3 main initiatives that have really focused on inclusivity of our population, specifically people of color. In our workforce and education initiative, we know that our future workforce are people of color, specifically those that are Hispanic or Latino, with 42% of our school-age children identifying as Hispanic or Latino. The second is in 2015, we stood up an immigration learning community that was specifically focused on supporting immigrants and migrants in our region. And so there was a group of about 175 people that came together, from lawyers to social services to other community foundations, but really from the private sector, the public sector, really trying to meet the needs of immigrants in our community, in our region, specifically legal assistance, refugees, entrepreneurship, arts and culture, and a wide range of other things. And we specifically had an entrepreneurial cohort program for about 3 years, and several of the immigrant, whether they're first gen or second gen entrepreneurs, are currently going through our impact investment process to help grow their businesses, because as was said earlier, they don't have access to traditional lending often when they migrate here. And then the last piece is with that learning community is they're in the process of trying to get a little bit more organized to understand how they can long-term support immigrants and migrants into our community. And we've had influx of Afghanistan and Ukrainian refugees. And so what their role is to do that. And then I think lastly, we've been part of CCA for the past several years to better understand the relationship between immigrants, migrants in our region and their countries of origin. And so this evolves consistently across our work.
Thank you, John. Wonderful. I think you did a great job of connecting all that. Stuart, my Delaware, I grew up outside of Philadelphia, so it's pretty much my neighbor in that other part of my life. Wonderful to have you here, and please share.
Great to be here. Thanks so much. Yes, just first of all, quick word about Delaware. Many of you have probably driven through Delaware and never stopped in Delaware. It is the second smallest state after Rhode Island, only 90 miles top to bottom, and in our narrowest part, only 6 miles wide. So it is a little place. And in spite of that, very different parts of the state. For the migrant community, particularly Latino, Hispanic, particularly Mexican, Guatemalan, we've been focusing in Sussex County, where there's been a heavy migrant community. And our work in that space has been in a few ways. One, of course, we did the study a few years ago at the CCA saying, what is the population, showing dramatic growth over the last 20 years from basically 1,200 people to over 25,000 people. So it may seem small, but that's 10% of that county's population. Supporting heavily a group that has provided coordination around a broad set of social services, wraparound services. And I'll say more about learnings on that, but that group providing significant support, a large coalition of folks building over time. Through one of our donor advised funds, particular support for trying to expand services into non-Latino organizations and say this needs to be part of the overall approach. And thirdly, and most recently, and I think importantly coming out of the study has been the work to develop something called La Plaza, which has largely turned into a business development, business training, micro loans, real loans for people in the Latino community, particularly in the county seat of Georgetown, trying to take advantage of what we talked about in our study, which is there's huge economic potential and huge economic desire for small business entrepreneurs. We need to tap into that. We need to do something with that. And that's what this organization is doing. And we're trying to help them get there. More to come.
Thank you, Stuart. Beautiful. Your alarm was all set. Great.
I was set. I have 4 seconds left.
Wonderful. So the second question is one that I find very interesting because I'm a big believer in that Western society compartmentalizes everything and sort of separates things. And I think what I believe is that we need to try to find ways to be holistic and integrating of things and our activities. So as community foundations, the idea isn't that like, well, oh, so we have this side program over here that has to do with migrants. Rather, how does it play in and align with the rest of the activity of the whole of the community foundation's activities? So we're going to go do the same sort of sequence, hearing from the Mexican side of the border first, and then from the US side of the border, and working with this common idea of being a migrant. So Alma, again.
Thank you. Nogales has faced a very different kind of demographics in the past 5 years. We always had Mexicans from the southern border and a lot of from Zacatecas and Jalisco, but mostly Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas. All of a sudden, 6 years ago, we started having 300 Haitians that stay here for a long time. That completely changed the face of migration. Then we started having a lot of people from Central America, Cubans, Venezuelans, etc. So everything changed. And during the pandemic too, because of how the services were provided, The main shelter closed. The other one accepted anyone without any kind of testing. We didn't have any testing. So we now have divided migration for us in Nogales prior to COVID, that's for 40 years, during COVID, 2 years, and migration post-COVID. So we really want to focus on the new agenda of migration, which is many, many kids, and the pro bono organizations in the United States that are legally supporting the shelters. It's exactly the thing that we needed, the tool to make this happen. In many other towns, people have stayed there for a year and a half. They are called Los Olvidados, the forgotten ones, who are now moving to Nogales, to the shelters in Nogales, because everyone has a cell phone. And they have found out that you might have some kind of legal support. So we are now facing a multicultural network of migrants in the shelters. And of course, that just think of your family during Thanksgiving and after day 3, everyone is ready to go home and you hate each other. So with the migrants being there for 9 months, okay, there has to be a cultural structure. More than food and education, the cultural structure, who cooks? Well, you get to cook your original food from your hometown for a week. That's wonderful. You give them the opportunity to talk about it. So it's the little things, the cultural events among it that really, really have made it so interesting for us as a community foundation and so challenging for the shelters.
Thank you, Alma. Yes, that the things at the border are a whole different world. It's not even this side or that side in some ways. It's a different place. Jalil, more central Mexico. How are you living with this and integrating this? Go ahead.
Esta tiene que ver con la pregunta número 2, ¿cierto? Aún. Claro, pues miren, nosotros desde nuestra visión como Fundación Comunitaria Malinalco está enfocada directamente al desarrollo comunitario, es decir, a hacer visibles todos esos activos sociales con los que cuenta la comunidad. Y creo que en nuestro caso, aquí en el centro, el fenómeno de la migración no lo podemos encerrar simplemente como en una problemática, sino que lo debemos de ver como un fenómeno todo complejo, porque también deja cosas buenas, así como otras cosas, o hay ciertas modificaciones en nuestro municipio en torno a todo este fenómeno, ¿no? Entonces, nosotros estamos buscando que este fenómeno cultural de la migración pueda integrarse, digamos, en dinámicas culturales positivas, como se los mencionaba hace un momento, mediante estos proyectos socioambientales que nosotros promovemos, que nosotros buscamos como fundación, que tienen un impacto integral y holístico, como decía Eric, en nuestras comunidades, pero queremos que los migrantes también los vean, los perciban y que se den cuenta de que podemos trabajar en conjunto a pesar de estar en distintos países, a pesar de estar a lejanía, pues como para romper estas dinámicas y crear una especie de colaboración transfronteriza mutua entre los migrantes de Estados Unidos y los migrantes y las familias que se quedan aquí en Malinalco. No es que estemos fomentando que la migración tenga que seguir surgiendo, pero sí buscamos dar otras posibilidades.
Thank you, Jalil. Wonderful. So again, the question is, how is this work with migrants and migration relate to and align with the broader vision of your community foundation? And now we'll hear from the north of, or the US side of the border anyway. So please, John.
Funny, Eric, I've never heard of Florida called the North, but technically it is. So yeah, so Collaboratory's big goal is, that we launched a year ago, is we're committed to coordinating the solving of all of our region's social issues and doing it in a generation. So in 18 years. And like I said before, our community is rapidly diversifying, whether it's refugees or folks from Mexico or Central and South America or the Caribbean. Our population is very diverse, and it's diversifying rapidly. And so we have to build trust and strong relationships with all different sections of our community, but all different populations from our community that we haven't historically done a great job with that. All of our programming looks through an equity lens, so we have to understand that anything that we do, how is this fair and equitable to everybody in our community, not just those that currently have all of the power and the privilege. And so for us, that helps us better understand our gaps and our challenges, specifically around how the way we've done things have maybe negatively impacted immigrants and migrants in the past. And there's invisible systems that are in play and that affect immigrants and migrants often. We heard a couple of those about lending and credit, about being able to purchase property, whatever those systems that are in play that intentionally or unintentionally create challenges for people that are moving to our country and to our community. And so we have to work on those invisible systems at all levels. Otherwise, we can't solve anything. And then lastly, we use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to measure our impact, because that's a global framework. That's not just a US framework. And so it's a common language and structure that we can measure all of our work up together that can be communicated across borders. So that's how we've been trying to tie everything up to our big goal.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for bringing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, into the conversation, because they're kind of an important background that unites all our programs as community foundations. So wonderful. And Stuart, take us away.
Yeah, thank you again, Eric. Well, at a very basic level, our goal is a high quality of life for everybody in the state and reducing the opportunity gap, and whoever that is included in there. And obviously there need to be more explicit plans around immigrant communities with higher needs, just as we have to have more explicit plans around African-American communities that have been underserved. This is a border state. We're the only state in the country that's east of the Mason-Dixon line, because Mason-Dixon line ends at our western border, but we sure acted like a southern state at the time. So, but in all of our programs, our work is inclusive of the different needs of immigrant communities. So our work around equity is inclusive of migrants. Our statewide work addressing social determinants of health, we have explicit inclusion of migrant communities. In our COVID work, the needs of migrant communities was elevated as we were making grants that addressed particular needs. And I would add that at the state level, there is a lot of support for this, particularly within the Department of Health, with whom we're very close. And the state recognizes it in other ways. A word about Sussex County, the fastest growing county in our state, huge influx of population, wealthy people moving into the beach communities, largely because of low income or low property taxes, moving out of New Jersey and Pennsylvania to come here. But what that also means is housing is at a premium, and the service communities cannot afford to live there anymore, and that is heavily a migrant community, and that there's not good transportation to get people to those jobs, and that the salaries aren't adequate for pretty much any of the services. And so the state recognizes a critical economic impact of not taking care of those communities. And so these are issues that are real for everybody, particularly people in that part of the state. And that's how we play.
I like, John says, is that aligned or entangled? I don't know. Well said. Well, good reflection. Wonderful. So our last question is really, it's like about lessons learned, but I'd say it's kind of like that open-ended question, like what were the takeaways? What was, and what do you want to share that we should know that that will help the rest of us in our own work? So I mean, feel free to make that a question that however you feel best engages with us. What have you learned, and what can we learn from you? So, Alma, again, thank you. Go ahead.
Listening to Halil, I'm sorry. I'm very interested in Halil in keeping the contact. I would love to know how many people from Malinalco we have. They all said Estado de Mexico. Maybe we can, after we have a conversation, we can ask the shelters to make that specific question when they say Estado de Mexico, both for the deported and for those newly arrived. I think that will be wonderful for both of us. So let me know if you are interested and then we can talk about it. That's my main takeaway today. And the other one is the numbers in Delaware. It's amazing that people don't complain in Delaware about the undocumented people. Of course, they are working. And it's a completely different story for me. Really, I had never thought of Delaware ever. So that's another very interesting conversation for our binational partnership with other organizations. I will also very much be in touch with you.
Thank you, Alma. And Halil, now that the connection is made.
Pues mira, para comenzar, nosotros somos un municipio que se encuentra ubicado en el Estado de México. El Estado de México es un estado completo aquí en el país y nosotros solo somos un pequeñito municipio que reciente la información del reciente censo que se realizó en 2020, estamos rozando los 30,000 habitantes. O sea, somos todavía una comunidad rural. No tenemos un dato exacto de cuántas personas migrantes existan de Malinalco en los Estados Unidos, pero sí podríamos decir que son muchísimas, ¿no? Son una buena cantidad conforme a este número de personas. Una de las más grandes lecciones que nosotros hemos aprendido a lo largo de todo este trabajo, y creo que una de las principales, pues es la parte de la sensibilización. Escuchar todas las historias, escuchar del por qué las personas migran, por qué las personas optan o ven a la migración como una posibilidad, pues nos lleva a que para ellos es un reto que pues es un sueño de una nueva vida. Y todo lo que implica es muchísimo, desde el sentir, desde la confianza que deposita una familia malinalquense en uno de sus miembros que va a hacer la travesía y que va a cruzar o que va a moverse hacia los Estados Unidos, es un sentido de nostalgia muy grande, ¿no? Ellos básicamente están depositando su porvenir sobre esta persona. También todo lo que la persona al migrar lleva consigo, pues es una carga de que lo tiene que lograr, tiene que cumplir la misión y todo lo que implica encomendarse a sus santos, encomendarse a su religión, hacerlo por una persona querida, pues es un proceso bastante fuerte, porque aparte lo que ellos viven al migrar, es muy duro. Existen muchas organizaciones que eso no es lo bueno dentro del fenómeno de la migración, que se aprovechan de esto. Principalmente quienes migran a veces son personas con muy bajos recursos, pero que están ahorrando a lo largo de varios años o están endeudándose con otras personas para poder hacer el viaje. Y hay organizaciones que se aprovechan de esto y les prometen un falso, una falsa promesa para estafarlos, ¿no? Entonces, todas estas vivencias nos han enriquecido muchísimo para nosotros poder partir de un punto.
Gracias, Halil. Wonderful. You bring up some other issues that certainly have to do with all this, and we'll continue in our forums, but there's the question of the right to migrate and the need to migrate, and the question of the right not to migrate. And sometimes in many villages and towns, there's not a right to not migrate because there's not options within a village. And that brings into question a whole lot of questions of social justice and related things. So that will continue that conversation. And so now let's again hear from John.
Yeah, I really resonates with me the idea of migration is a human right, and whether it's choosing to or not to is something that I think when we look at our role specifically in community foundations, how are we supporting that as a human right, is something that I think we've learned in our work of what is our role in looking at it as a human right, as we do with housing and food and water and all of those other things. How do we look at migration as as something in that same conversation for whatever reasons. I think the most important thing that is layered that we have learned is that I personally have learned is we have a lot to learn in how we support our immigrant and migrant communities. I think you know, the barriers are vast in this country of how, you know, you get to some sort of path to residency, even if you don't want citizenship, but you know, the barriers are huge, and how we learn from those systems that I referenced before and mentioned before, and where they're broken to support immigrants and migrants specifically. And in order to do that, representation matters. And so who is going into community to understand, and how are we going into community to understand what those challenges and barriers are, so we can improve what we are doing. Quick short story, Corporativa de Fundaciones and Lisa were here about a month ago, and they came and we went to Immokalee, which is a predominantly migrant community in Southwest Florida. And the moment I got there, you could see everybody retract, you know, white guy, collared shirt. And so, like, paying attention to how we also have to enter into community in order to build that trust. And then the last thing I would say is the solutions have to be designed by the immigrant and migrant communities, not for them. And if we keep designing the solutions for them without them being designed by them, we're never going to get to anything that works for the community. So those would be the takeaways that we've learned. But yeah, I mean, we have a lot to learn. I think we all do, and we have to continue to be listening to what those barriers are and what those needs actually are.
Thank you, John. That's my motto: not for, but with and by the people. And also, like, the concept that that our learnings, as you learn more, you realize how much more we need to learn. So yeah, very, very accurate. Go ahead, take it away, Stuart.
All right, thank you. And Alma, a quick note. The fact that you've never thought about Delaware, the truth is, and don't tell anybody in Delaware this, but I never thought about Delaware until I got this job. So it's a truth for many people. A few things to say, and I think some of them are related to what John was just saying. Number one big lesson is around trust and building trust and how long you're with the community. And we are a largely white professional organization based in Wilmington, in the northern part of the state. So we are not in the community. We are not living the life as the DCF staff. So we are heavily dependent upon working with partners who are in the community, with not just intermediaries, but local agents and actors, because, you know, I think about this in terms of we need to know, all of us need to know our lane, need to know our role. And our role is not to be knocking on doors in the community. It won't do anything. So that's number one. Number two, as a community foundation, our work is on dozens of issues simultaneously. And while we include immigrant and migrant issues in those, it doesn't always come out. And for many people, I think of us, community foundations generally, as being a little bit like the proverbial elephant with the blind people. Everybody knows something about us, whether it's our scholarship programs or whether it's our funds for environmental issues or our work on preschool, but they don't understand the totality. And so for us, it can be confusing what we do, even though we try to have our through line about opportunity and inclusion. And that's something that gets in the way sometimes. Third, we try hard to get other donors that we work with engaged in these issues explicitly, and it's exceedingly difficult to do. Some donors are hostile to this work. Some donors just don't care. And it's an ongoing challenge how we bring more resources to the table for these specific issues.
Thank you, Stuart. Wonderful. This has been a great comment and lots of thoughts. We do have a couple more minutes. So if there are questions, if somebody can either raise your hand or write in the chat. But try to keep it brief because we won't have time for an answer if the question gets too long. But please feel free. Not all at once now.
I think
And also,
there's been a lot said just to think about today.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, the panelists, if there's a final thought that just something like maybe as you are hearing the last person speak, something just came up that you just are burning to share with us.
Something I really love that came out of the conversation today is this connection making, right? That you mentioned, Alma. And this is the whole purpose of connecting communities in the Americas, is as we share together. Online is very practical way to do it because it's much more difficult for us to all get in the same room from where we are. But this is how connections are made across community foundations, partnering in work across countries. And so in that sense, it's what we're all about. Yes.
If I can, just one observation. I don't know how this will play out, but the discussion about immigration with Ukraine is obviously a different discussion than the discussion about immigration from Afghanistan, and is a different discussion than immigration about Mexico and Guatemala and the other Americas. And I don't know how we link those things. I mean, there's this overflow of love right now for Ukraine and for people coming from Ukraine. And I know for some people on this call, this is a very personal thing. And I don't know what we can do to turn that into an overflowing of love for all peoples and an understanding that we're all in this together. But it seems to me there might be an opportunity, and others who've been more involved in immigration issues might have better ideas on how to do that. But I find a particular comparison of Afghanistan and Ukraine compelling, but it's also related to the Americas and how we entertain those discussions.
Thank you for bringing that into the space. That's something I think that's present for all of us now at some kind of level, and trying to connect. And you say that's disconnected right now in our own minds and experiences.